Hey, welcome back to With Explorer. I want to thank you for joining. We've been through a roller coaster with regards to the country of France in the continent of Africa. The gendarme of Africa, the policeman of Africa, has come to the point where France today to realize its African policy is that of disgrace and total failure in the geopolitical environment, and Africa's partners are watching. In this episode, I want to dive deeper into providing some advice to French policymakers in terms of how they will engage the continent of Africa on where Africa is at the moment. I will give you an introductory discussions. I have a notes that I've taken down. I've also dived into some extensive research like I always do, so I will talk about analysis here. Secondly, I will explore the impact on France's global standing in terms of its diplomatic relations with other African partners across Washington, the United States of America, China, Asian partners, Russia, Middle Eastern partners, emerging Turkey. I will even explore if there is any way forward for the country of France. So I will encourage you to smash the like button, support this channel. I will dive into the research and I will see you at the end of this video. The condemnation of French politics have gained momentum in recent years in French-speaking Africa. The grievances are multiple: military intervention, the persistence of the regional currency inherited from colonial times, talking about the CFA franc, development aid policy, retrieval visa policy, and more importantly, the reasons that criticism against the French policy in the African continent, to the point out, has turned into an anti-French diatribe and on social networks and in simplistically rhetoric for neo-Pan-Africanism. In this context, the relationship between France and three countries in the Sahel region have been turned off in only just the past couple of years, talking about 2021 to 2022. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were members of the anti-jihadist coalition called the G5 Sahel and hosted French and European forces fighting jihadists within this particular region. These three countries, some officers replaced the elected president and ended the security partnership with Paris. They cancelled the defense agreement signed with the French government and asked the French troops to leave. By doing so, they also terminated the military engagement of the European Union and the United Nations peacekeeping missions in Mali, known as MINUSMA. Since then, there has been no French ambassador in those countries, and the French embassy in Niger was shut down on January the 2nd, 2024. French development aid and delivery of visas have been suspended after this brutal coups, and looking at the severing of ties with France and the European Union. Those governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have been sanctioned by the Economic Community of West African States, known as ECOWAS, and the West African Economic and Monetary Union. These governments have also decided to leave the ECOWAS and officially created their own regional coalition, the Alliance of the Sahelian State. They have solicited support from several countries, including the Gulf countries, Turkey, also including Iran and China and more, and their main security partner is now Russia. This change of partnership was quite a surprise for Paris and Washington, as some of the military rulers also were trained and also prepared in terms of their trainings and development, in terms of their skills and other areas, and used in cooperation with regards to their partnership in those regions. Despite French official statement downplaying the changes of alliance, this setback is a real crisis. But it is not only a crisis between France and the Sahelian countries, a crisis between France and Africa as a whole, or a crisis of French policy in the continent of Africa. The impact for the French diplomacy in the continent of Africa and the global community has been huge. The impact of this evolution in France-African relations has felt well beyond Africa. The image of French diplomacy is damaged because its role as an advocate and a life insurer of African states is now questioned. The role of France in Africa has transformed from the last century to present one, described as the policeman of Africa in charge of protecting the African-friendly regimes during the Cold War. France has played the role of the last resort in times of disaster. Looking at in the 21st century, when you do have the European Union send peacekeeping mission in some African civil wars during that period, talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2003 and also 2006, and more importantly looking at March in 2007 and 2009, the Central African Republic in 2015 to 2016. France was the lead nation. With the Barkhane operation, France played the same role in fight against jihadis in the Sahel region. The French army supported the engagement of European troops in the Sahel, notably the Takuba task force based in Burkina Faso at the time. But as the French army had to withdraw from this battlefield, this division of labor among the Western countries de facto ended. As the French military presence has been delegitimized in the Sahel, some European countries distanced from France and maintained their military engagement without French support. Italy and Germany, for example. For instance, in 2003, Hungary decided to deploy troops in Chad and sign a bilateral agreement with the government. In the same way, the United States of America's government more and more involved in security issues in French-speaking Africa, showing that it does not rely on the previous division of labor anymore. In addition, the role of the lead nation on African security issue was accepted by the African government as long as Paris could use its diplomatic influence and know-how, their benefits in the United Nations and the European Union. This bargain is now put into question. For a long time now, French diplomacy has been the voice of international solidarity with the poor countries, according to experts in multilateral organizations, the G20, the European Union, and so on. President Emmanuel Macron kept playing this part to an extent, and he has also sponsored several pro-African initiatives to an extent, such as the Summit for the Funding of African Economies. However, the anti-French discourse in Africa puts this part into question. Nobody respects France in the continent of Africa anymore, and many undermine the work of French diplomacy in the multilateral organization. As a result, this diplomatic crisis with some African countries resonates not only in Dakar, for example, Senegal, or Bamako, or Abidjan, but also in Brussels, Washington, and in New York, where the stakes are much higher for French diplomacy failures across the region. Formulating a new French policy for Africa will be a major mistake. Firstly, each French newly elected government has done so since 1981, and this has become a political cliché. Secondly, the present climate of mutual distrust between France and Africa will make implementation of a new partnership very difficult. In this respect, the recognition of the colonial violence and the youth-oriented aid policy, that is, sponsoring sports and cultural activities through development aid, will not be enough to change the anti-French resentment, and also in short term or in the medium term. So to point out, instead of systematically assuming that France has important interests to protect in French-speaking Africa, the French decision makers should first identify and assess those interests, whatever they are, security, economic, or cultural. These interests should not be taken at face value or should not be regarded as a shameful secret. A cost-benefit analysis of these interests and the clarification of the political debate about them seriously needed. In 2024, rethinking the French interest in Africa is not a taboo, but a necessity looking at what has happened as we are now in 2025, considering France's president's remarks in regards to how we perceive the continent of African countries French-speaking to being ungrateful. For example, among the 5 more important French trade partners in Africa, there is no country from the Western African Economic and Monetary Union. Ivory Coast is the 9th trading partner of France in Africa, while Nigeria, Angola, and also South Africa are the 3 most important African trading partners. In this addition to the reassessment of the French interest in Africa, the French decision makers should address 3 problematic issues, which I'm going to help you to address. So to point out, Disconnecting between analysis and policy is important. It would be wrong to assume that the deterioration of the relation between France and Africa was not anticipated. On one hand, the revolution related to the new political generations and the intensification of global competition was not unseen and unspoken by various experts and journalists across the region and also from France. On the other hand, the stalemate of the war against jihadists in the Sahel was also analyzed. The French policy in Africa has been characterized by a disconnection between analysis and diplomacy. In the French institutional system, foreign policy is the president's prerogative, and African policy is even more and the prerogative of the president. Given the fact that the president is the decision maker in African policy, he can easily ignore disseminating analysis, whether it comes academically or media, intelligence services, or foreign services. This evolution towards a hyper-presidency and also conduct of the African policy behind closed doors at the Elysee contributed to the failures of the new African policy announced by President Emmanuel Macron in 2017. A National Assembly report titled Rapport de disinformation sur les relations entre la France et l'Afrique, published in November of 2023, outlined this issue and recommend opening up of the closed-door decision-making process to institutional stakeholders. The other thing which I think is total failure is that the culture of paternalism in France-African relations. The culture of paternalism in Africa/France relations, so to point out, is a legacy of colonial past. However, this is not only characteristics of the old French politicians. The two youngest French presidents proved that they were not immune to the culture of paternalism. Nicolas Sarkozy declared in a famous speech in Dakar that the African man was not yet modern. Emmanuel Macron made several diplomatic faux pas Burkina Faso at the time, and also Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Comoros. It is high time that France politicians, so to point out, become aware of their paternalistic, as it is very damaging to the French and African relationship. One thing more I can advise France in this case would be the contradictions between the migration policy and French policy in Africa. In France, most of the migrants present come from the African continent. North Africa is the first region of origin of immigration in France, and Sub-Saharan Africa is the second. The anti-migration view shared by most of the French political class is at stark contrast with their discourse about cooperation and solidarity with Africa. The politicians who advocate for a close partnership between France and Africa are often the very same ones who are in favor of preventing Africans from coming to France. In fact, the very restrictive visa policy implemented for several years seriously hampered the development of economic and cultural relations with Africa. Some politicians both advocate for development of the French-African relations and for the reduction of immigration, ignoring that Africa is the poorest continent, so they pointed, according to some experts, which I think that if Africa was not being exploited tremendously the way it is today, the continent of Africa would have found its own grounds, and desperate Africans are seeking for a life outside their own continent to an extent. This contradiction is unaided in the French political debate, and this should not be something that the country of France should consider. I think that France has actually disgraced itself in the continent of Africa. The France's brand and image has been disseminated in West Africa in particular, and France will continue to struggle if France does not revise its relationship with the continent of Africa, go back to the drawing board and look at those policies on how they work. It is important at this time that the continent of Africa make those strategic choices for partners that will provide win-win situation. I want to thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Smash the like button, share the video, watch other informative content on our YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.